This is going to be the first of 2 videos on bird vocalizations. And actually I'm going to branch out even from there and just talk about some of the sounds that birds make. But in most cases that'll be vocalizations. So first of all, what is a sound? How are sounds made? Well, basically it's just the coordinated movement of air molecules, and here's a little illustration of that using a drum. So if you beat the drum, the kind of membrane associated with a drum, it causes air molecules to attract to the surface of that, and then it bounces back, shown here in the middle figure, and that will send those air molecules to your own tympanic membrane, causing it to vibrate and creating the sound. Well, how do we actually quantify vocalizations or sounds made by birds? And there are actually a couple of methods that we can use to do that, but they measure slightly different things. So one is using an oscillogram. An oscillogram indicates the amplitude of a vocalization. So think about the amplitude as being how loud it is. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of ways of measuring the same vocalization. So we're going to use the Hey Sweetie song of a black-capped chickadee. And if you look at it from the oscillogram point of view, you can see that both parts of it, the hey and the sweetie, are comparable in how loud they are, but the hey is a little bit louder because you see that lines going away from 0 as far as the pressure being measured is greater. So occasionally wanting to know the amplitude is something that might be measured, but in most cases what we want to learn is what frequencies a bird vocalization encompasses. And so the best way to do that is looking at a sonogram. A sonogram, so the x-axis is still time, so we're going to be playing a vocalization, and what it shows is the variation in frequencies that are used in that vocalization. So the Hey Sweetie would look like this. And so remember, we had the higher, slightly higher amplitude, but also the hey is a slightly higher frequency than the sweetie. So it'll sound oftentimes, just we think about this as higher, and the sweetie will be slightly lower in the vocalization. But these are relatively pure vocalizations. They use a relatively narrow range of frequency, and we'll talk about narrow band versus broadband vocalizations later. There is a third way that you can quantify the vocalizations that birds make that encompasses both the information in a sonogram and an oscillogram, and this is using a colored sonogram. So a colored sonogram is going to be, basically it'll look like a sonogram. It shows us the frequencies that are used, but the brightness of the color indicates the amplitude. So let's actually play one of these vocalizations now to indicate this. And so I'm going to go to a website that is created by the authors of your book. So you can see the hey is a little bit louder and a little higher than the sweetie. Well, how did ornithologists study bird vocalizations and report and communicate the nature of vocalizations prior to our electronic capabilities? Well, kind of the old school sonograms actually used piano scores and actually tried to relate vocalizations in birds in musical terms. So I'm going to play you the vocalization of a wood thrush and then compare that to what the piano score version of that would sound like. Now let's see what that would sound like based on an imitation of it by a piano score, which if you just listen to that wood thrush vocalization, I think a flute would have been a better comparison because it's a very flute-like vocalization.
Track 39, piano score representing wood thrush song.
So not a bad attempt, but I think you can agree that our modern technology is going to be much more efficient at communicating how birds vocalize. So I mentioned some of the basic characteristics of vocalizations being either narrow frequency or narrow band sounds versus broad band or broad frequency vocalizations. Now clearly it's a continuum, but we generally refer to these in this regard because oftentimes one or the other is very functional in certain environments or in certain contexts. So for example, a bird like this white-throated sparrow that we've been seeing all winter, they're beginning to really sing now. They produce vocalizations that have been described as saying, "Poor old Sam, Peabody, Peabody, Peabody." But notice how kind of line-like, dash-like each of these are. So each part of the phrasing really represents a very narrow range of frequencies. And so when you hear a white-throated sparrow, it has a very kind of pure whistle, a very musical type of vocalization. Now let's contrast that to a broad frequency or broad band vocalization, or in this case it's not necessarily a vocalization, but it's a sound. So if you listen to woodpeckers, they do produce vocalizations, but they also communicate by doing what is called drumming behavior. And here is the colored spectrogram or sonogram of 3 different woodpecker species that we've been seeing in lab. At least 2 of these we've seen in lab. We've seen the downy woodpecker on the top and the yellow-bellied sapsucker on the bottom. So I'm not going to play you all of these drumming sounds, but they do vary somewhat with the rapidity of their drumming phrases, but they're all pretty much encompassing the same broad frequencies. And so they're going to produce this very harsh-like sound. Let's just contrast that now with the hairy. So it sounds very similar as far as the frequencies that are used. They're both producing this harsh drumming sound, but the hairy woodpecker just does it much faster. Well, let's return back to talking about vocalizations. How do birds make their vocalizations? Well, we use our larynx and laryngeal muscles to do so, but that's not the case in birds. Their vocal box is called the syrinx. And the syrinx is at the base of the trachea where the 2 primary bronchi branch off to the lungs. And they're covered in syringeal muscles, which we're going to see are very important in determining the vocal capabilities of birds. So if you look closely at a section of the syrinx, you can see the functional parts. So we have this intraclavicular air sac. This is going to be important for resonance and producing certain frequencies. But the kind of whistling sound itself is created by vibrations of these internal and external labia. So these are muscles that can change the shape of this opening going into the primary bronchi and create this whistling sound. Now, since it's going into 2 different air pipes, birds can actually make different vocalizations using each of the openings on either side of the larynx. And so it can produce these layered, very complex vocalizations, and the wood thrush song was a good example of that. So we can see that we've got this multi-layered harmonic up here that's going to be higher than these lower distinct phrases down low. So let's listen to that.
Track 40, Wood Thrush Song.
So the kind of that vibration sounding is this bottom part, but that kind of layered vocalization is, the higher one is up here. Here's an example of an even more complex vocalization produced by an Australian magpie. Which, by the way, I just watched a movie that featured an Australian magpie that I would definitely recommend, called Penguin Bloom. That's a single bird. So very impressive. So as I mentioned, the syringeal muscular complexity oftentimes correlates well with the vocal capabilities of birds. And if you look at the Aucine passerines, so when we look at the order Passeriformes, we can break it up into the sub-Aucines and the Aucines. All passerines are called perching birds, but only the Aucine passerines are called the songbirds. The sub-Aucines include things like the flycatchers, which do have vocalization capabilities, but they're usually not as complex as that in the true songbirds. And if you look at non-passerines, they have very simple musculature in most cases. And in fact, some birds, non-passerines, lack syringeal muscles entirely and can really only make hissing vocalizations, like vultures, many of the ratites, and storks. So the syrinx and its morphology really affects the vocalizations primarily, but there are some other behaviors and anatomical structures that can influence the vocalizations produced by the syrinx, including the pattern of breathing. Birds can make different vocalizations breathing in and out, and by varying the rate at which they breathe in and out in burst, they can change their vocalization. You will see birds moving their bills in variable ways when they're producing vocalizations, and that also varies the sound that is produced. And the pressure associated with the abdominal and the thoracic muscles also can affect things like the amplitude and the frequencies produced. We talked about the function of the air sacs and storage of air during respiration, but the pressure in the air sacs can also affect the resonance associated with the sounds that are produced by birds, as can the length of the trachea, as I mentioned previously. So birds that can produce these highly resonant vocalizations oftentimes have a coiled trachea. And again, I kind of compared that to how a French horn can produce its sound because of its highly coiled brass components. Well, let's talk about the different kind of classifications of vocalizations that birds produce. And I'm going to make it fairly simple and just talk about songs and calls. Songs are typically the much more complex vocalizations, and they're typically only sung by males, at least in temperate zone regions. Now, there are some exceptions to that in the temperate zone, and certainly in the tropical region, both males and females can produce song more regularly. The function of song in males is usually territory defense and mate attraction, and there can be slight variation in the songs that they use for each of these functions. So in other words, there are certain types of songs that are more efficient at mate attraction and others that are more efficient at competing with other males and defending their territory. So here's a song of a common yellowthroat, a bird that we can see in open wetland type habitats here in East Texas pretty soon. You can really hear the witchety, witchety, witchety. And as I mentioned, songs can be incredibly variable and very complex. And sometimes the complexity of that is a very important indicator of the male quality, and it's both important for male competition and territory defense, but also attracting a female mate. So here's an example of a very complex song in the Pacific wren. We've already seen this semester how complex and variable the vocalizations of Carolina wrens can be, but wrens in general can just produce these amazing vocalizations, and I'm going to give you some more examples of that today. This is one of my favorites. This is called the musician wren. It's a tropical species, and it's called that because the song really is very musical. So vocalizations in birds can vary greatly in their frequencies. In some cases, they can encompass a fairly narrow range of very low frequencies, and so notice in the spruce grouse here, we're measuring in hertz, while in the black-polled warbler, we're measuring it in kilohertz. So a major difference, and let's listen to those. This is the spruce grouse. And in contrast, kind of the opposite end, we've got the black-polled warbler.
Black-polled warbler.
Another example of a bird that uses really high frequency vocalizations that we've been seeing in lab a lot this winter are the cedar waxwings. So when we looked at the wood thrush song earlier, I mentioned that there was this kind of layering of vocalizations. That's what we call a harmonic song. So we have layers of different frequencies that are centered around a fundamental frequency, and the fundamental frequency is the one shown here that's the darkest, because this tends to be the predominant one that you hear, but you can hear these other multiples of that frequency layered above and below that. So here's a good example of that in another thrush, the hermit thrush.
Hermit thrush.
So why do birds produce such a wide range of vocalizations that encompass different frequencies? Are there any patterns associated with this? And sure enough, there are. It turns out that there are different types of songs and different types of calls, as we'll see. We'll talk about calls here in a minute, that tend to work better in different environments. So if you're talking about a very dense forested habitat or a thick marsh habitat, it's difficult for songs to penetrate through that dense vegetation without getting reverberations and the song becoming degraded so that it loses its function. So what tends to work better in these habitats are simple, lower and narrower frequency songs. So they'll be kind of sweeter sounding, not as high, kind of low and very melodic oftentimes songs. Give you two examples of that. First we'll look at a tropical species, a tinamou. And another example a little closer to home is a bird that we'll have coming through in migration here in East Texas, the rose-breasted grosbeak.
Rose-breasted grosbeak.
Now, in contrast, if you get into really open habitats, particularly if there's a lot of wind associated with that, then a broad band vocalization that encompasses many frequencies but really centers around higher frequencies tends to work better. And oftentimes in combination with those characteristics, we see the use of very rapid short notes, kind of very clipped short notes. These tend to do better in wind because the vocalization is just repeated over and over again, such that if a gust of wind comes by, that same vocalization can be transmitted to the listener if they just listen long enough. It's just, bits and pieces of it will come through with breaks in the wind. So a great example of that is a grasshopper sparrow.
Grasshopper sparrow.
So what about urban environments? Are there certain anthropogenic changes in our environment that have caused birds to change their vocalizations? Absolutely. Because of the relatively low noises that are associated with an urban environment, so think about traffic and just leaf blowers and things like that, those tend to encompass lower frequency vocalizations. And so what birds are doing is they're kind of trying to scream over that by raising the frequencies of the vocalizations that they use. So, for example, if you compare northern cardinals in an urban setting versus a rural setting, or northern mockingbirds in an urban versus rural, in the urban setting, they'll be using more higher frequency vocalizations. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the function of song. I've already kind of indicated this in a little bit. Well, fundamentally, in the mating process, it's part of species recognition. So males and females can pair up correctly and mate with an individual of their species. But to females, a male's vocalization can indicate their mate's quality. What is a female listening to? Oftentimes the volume, so the amplitude is going to be important. The louder the vocalization, the better indication of quality, because these vocalizations are costly to produce, and the louder you can be, the greater the indication of your quality. Also the complexity. The more complex your vocalization may be an indication of your quality. And the cadence, how fast can you reproduce a vocalization, or how often? Again, if it's energetically expensive, that's going to be an honest signal of the male's quality. And this has been shown in studies of male house finches that successful males produce longer and louder and more complex vocalizations. So clearly this is important in mate choice, but it can also be important in males judging each other's quality in the struggle for territory defense. So males will pay attention to each other's vocalizations, and superior males with superior vocalizations are more likely to be able to successfully defend their territory. So that is the second main function of song, is territory defense. So individuals have different vocalizations, and the higher the quality of the vocalization, the more likelihood that the dominant male is going to get the best territory. But there's an additional function going on here. There is individual variation in different male vocalizations so that they can recognize each other. Because once they kind of fight it out over territorial boundaries, they don't want to have to keep doing that the entire breeding season. So by learning each other's vocalization, if Bob sounds different than Robert, well, I guess Bob and Robert are the same, right? So if Richard and Bob and John have different vocalizations, as long as they're calling from their territory, It's like, okay, we've already figured out where the territory boundaries are. We just check in occasionally to make sure that each other's there, but we don't have to continue physically fighting now. And so having that individual variation is important to increase effective communication. So again, what are some of the indications of a quality individual in a song? So again, the more songs per minute is a good indication of your health, because it is energetically costly to produce these vocalizations, and studies have shown that there is a tight correlation between greater male quality as indicated by song and their habitat quality. And if you supplement the feeding associated with a male, he will increase his song rate. So it's an indication, it appears to be an honest indication of his own nutritional status. But if that was a natural feeding situation, it would also be an indication of the male's true territory quality. So louder, faster, more consistent, and more quickly repeated songs are linked to a greater male quality. And this, again, is linked to greater dominance, better ability to attain a better territory and defend that territory. And also, we're going to find out in most birds, the earlier you breed in the breeding season, the better. And so dominant individuals with more high quality songs tend to breed earlier. In addition to that, we're going to talk about, in addition to getting fitness from your own mate at your own nest, individuals oftentimes can supplement their fitness or their reproductive success by achieving what is called extra-pair copulation. And extra-pair copulation means you're mating with other neighboring, if you're a male, neighboring females, and fathering some of the young in those nests as well. And sure enough, individuals with higher quality songs tend to be the individuals most successful in supplementing their fitness through the route of extra-pair copulation. So I mentioned earlier that in songs, there can be the two different functions. There can be mate attraction and territorial defense, and that slightly different versions of their song can be used for each of these functions. So the mate attraction tends to be less variable. But again, they tend to be across a species more variable among males for territorial defense. And so males will sing that song when they're trying to communicate to other males, saying, "Hey, this is me, and I'm Bob, and John will sound different." And they'll use those vocalizations to indicate that their territory is occupied. And there is a clear link between territorial defense and song production. Studies have also shown that if you put out a model, just the physical presence of a potential rival, a competing male potentially, by using a museum skin that's mounted to look fairly realistic, sometimes those will be attacked by neighboring males if they're seen, but certainly if you combine that with vocalization, it increases the attack rate significantly, as shown here with this Townsend's warbler attacking this museum mount. Here's another example of the importance of variation in territorial song on the behavior of males in territorial defense. It turns out in white-throated sparrows and other species that they tend to respond more aggressively to the vocalizations of strangers or even familiar songs if they're coming from the wrong location. So let's think about that. A stranger, again, doesn't know the rules, doesn't know where the territorial boundaries are, so that's a potential big threat, and you got to respond to that. A familiar vocalization, if it's coming from the right place, if Bob is calling from Bob's territory, that's fine, because you and Bob have already worked it out. But if suddenly Bob is calling from a different location, then you're wondering, what is up with Bob? Bob's not following the rules, and so it's going to elicit a much more strong territorial response. So here's a study that demonstrated that. So if we look at a normal boundary situation in which you do an artificial study where you're playing back a vocalization that is either a neighbor song coming from its correct area or a stranger song coming from that area, which should elicit like, hey, what's going on? I don't know who that is. They're in Bob's territory. Well, if you just look at the songs before the play, there's occasional song, just kind of a checking in kind of thing, like going, yep, this is my territory, here I am. And there's no difference between the trials this kind of pre-period in the trials in which the neighbor song was subsequently used or the stranger song was subsequently used. So this is just indicating that the individuals were in the same basic kind of mood or mode in each of these trials. But once in the playback period, look at the responses of the neighboring bird. So if you play the neighbor's vocalization in the appropriate area, yeah, it elicits a little bit more response, right? Because they're like, going, okay, yep, we cool? Yep, we know the rules, right? You stay over there. But it's just kind of helping to reinforce that a little bit. But if we talk about a situation in which we have a stranger's vocalization coming from that area, now that's going to elicit like, hey, what's going on here? I got to do something about this. And that can even persist. It'll go down a little bit after the playback period, but it still remains elevated compared to if you heard a neighbor coming from the right location. Now let's contrast that to a situation in which we have the playback of the neighbor's song and the stranger's song, and they're both coming from someplace they shouldn't be. So it's not just necessarily that you know Bob's vocalization. In this case, Bob's not playing by the rules and is acting like a stranger. And so that elicits this major threat and an elevated vocalization by the test birds. And again, you see kind of a comparable, even post-vocalization that's more similar to what we saw with the stranger coming from an unknown area in the first case. Here's another study that demonstrated the importance of song to territorial defense. So let's concentrate on the top row of figures first. What they did in this study was they identified the territories of birds that were going to be part of the study and broke them up into three basic groups: an experimental group, a controlled silent group, and a controlled sound group. So what they did in the study was they removed all of the birds that were associated with these territories, put them in cages temporarily during the process. And in the experimental group is they played pre-recorded vocalizations of those territorial owners. And while they weren't physically there, they sounded like they were there because the vocalizations were being played. So what is the two control groups? So the control sound group was speakers were also placed in these territories, and they were playing just some other sound that was the same kind of amplitude just to make sure it wasn't some artificiality introduced by using speakers in this situation. And then the other group was a controlled silent group, so there was no vocalization, no speakers, anything in this situation. And what they wanted to do was then see how quickly these territories were taken over by other birds in the community of that species. And what they found is just 8 hours after removal, the territories associated with the controlled silent and the controlled sound primarily were the territories that were intruded upon and taken over by new occupants. Well, let's compare what happened in experiment 2. What was interesting about this is they thought, well, maybe the reason why the experimental territories were not taken over in this time frame didn't have anything to do with the fact that we were broadcasting songs of the previous owners. Maybe what was going on is we just happened to put those experimental groups in the kind of crappiest territories. So, all of the birds that were invading these new unoccupied territories just picked the ones that were the best territories, and the experimental ones just weren't worth retaking. So they redid the experiment the next year in the same areas, but they swapped the experimental and control treatments. And what they found is that, sure enough, we see the same result. What was previously the control silent and the control sound areas were now the experimental groups, and still we saw that the experimental groups in which you have the playback of the previous owners were the ones that were the last or were not invaded with at least within a 10-hour period. So I mentioned male song is the rule, generally the rule in temperate zone species, and females rarely sing. But in tropical species, female song is more likely to occur. And in some cases, there is even duetting seen in pair bonds to both maintain the pair bond and also to establish the pair bond initially. So these are two bearded barbets. You can see that they're cooperating in a duet. And here's the vocalization of one of my favorite species, another tropical wren. Again, if you go to the tropics, you'll hear some amazing vocalizations, and oftentimes those are associated with wrens. And here's one of my favorites. So that's two birds. Here you're going to hear just one of them, and didn't get the repeat. And then they'll start duetting. And here's one of the exceptions to the rule. Here is a temperate zone species in which you do see at least some simple song duetting between males and females of Carolina wrens. All right, let's move on to talking about calls. What is a call and how does it differ from a song? Calls typically are much simpler vocalizations, and they're usually produced by both males and females, and they serve a variety of functions. So they can be as simple as like little contact calls, so that as a flock of birds are traveling through a habitat, they're making these little chip notes to kind of indicate each other's location. Sometimes they can indicate a mobbing threat. Sometimes they can indicate an alarm that there's a predatory attack and everybody should dive for cover. So here's an indication of this with chickadees. So the A, B, C, and D components here are indicative of a chickadee, but different flocks will have different combinations of the A, B, C, D components organized in different ways. So that just kind of identifies flock identity. The gargle call seen on the bottom here is a different call that is typically more associated with males kind of getting angry with each other. The D notes here vary in the number, and the studies have indicated, I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, the number of D notes indicates the perceived threat when the chickadees see a predator. The more D notes, the greater the perceived threat. So that's the chickadee call with a flock identification and kind of the predatory threat D aspect of it. Here's the gargle call. So that is one of the main functions of calls, is to indicate that there's some sort of threat. Now, there are two different ways of dealing with a threat. And one type of threat call is called a mobbing call. And these tend to be broadband, very harsh sounding vocalizations. That's what is demonstrated here on the left. And when I'm pitching, oftentimes in labs, this is basically what I'm simulating. What a mobbing call does is it's a broadband vocalization that is relatively easy to identify the source of where it's coming from, especially when it focuses on the lower frequencies. Those are vocalizations that are easy to identify by location. And so that's what makes it effective. A chickadee could be doing one of these vocalizations and saying, hey, I found a potential threat. Y'all come join me. We'll mob this potential threat and drive it from the area so we all benefit. And so what we see is that there has been convergent evolution on mobbing vocalizations to make more efficient interspecific communication.
Track 19. Blue Jay mobbing calls. wren mobbing calls. Tufted titmouse mobbing calls. Mixed flock mobbing calls.
So I'm actually out on my back porch recording this lecture, and while I was playing those mobbing calls, I had a small flock of chickadees and titmice and cardinals and blue jays come up to the porch, and so it's clearly working. So that's when you want to attract individuals to potentially mob a predator. What if you see a threat, but this threat is such that it's too dangerous to mob, and instead what you're trying to do is indicate to others in the avian community that the threat exists, but minimize the chance that you will be attacked? Well, in that case, you're doing what's called an alarm call. An alarm call is very different. It uses a very high frequency. Now, you may be looking at this saying, well, that doesn't look very high compared to over here. Well, look, this is going from 0 to 8, encompassing that whole range. This is starting at 5, 9, so it's right around 6.5. So it's a relatively high whistle, and it's a very narrow range of frequencies, so it'll be a nice clean high whistle. Turns out that kind of vocalization is very difficult to identify where it's coming from. So it's an effective way to communicate to other birds, hey, there's a threat, dive for cover, go, do whatever you need to do to stay safe, but it minimizes the chance that the predator will find you. And sure enough, we see the same thing, that there is convergent evolution on similar signals across species.
Track 18. American robin high Z alarm calls. Tufted titmouse high Z alarm calls. Black-capped chickadee high Z alarm calls.
So you can see there's a big difference between mobbing calls and alarm calls. And here's a colored spectrogram showing the difference. So this is clearly a situation of an alarm call here on the left, and that's what might happen if a bird is attacked. It emits an alarm call. However, here we have a flock of birds mobbing this osprey, and in that situation you would more likely get this broadband mobbing call produced. Sometimes calls are used to indicate family membership, or actually individuals can vary in the specific calls that they produce to allow individuals to recognize one another. This is going to be particularly more important in colonial species or social species. Bank swallows, shown here on the bottom left, are a colonial species nesting together, and it's been demonstrated with cross-fostering and recording experiments that individuals can recognize where their young are, not necessarily just by the location of what is their nesting hole. They nest in these cavities here, but by the vocalizations that the offspring are using in those. So by cross-fostering, by taking individuals, say, from this cavity here and moving them over here, they're able to show that the parents wouldn't go back to this cavity that is their natural nest because it doesn't have their kiddos anymore in it. Their kiddos have been moved over here, and so they would visit this nest instead to feed their own young. So they're clearly recognizing that it is their young that are there. Well, some people question, could there be other cues that they're determining that's where their nestlings are, perhaps scent? And so what they did is they recorded the vocalizations of nestlings, say from this nest, and then they just removed those nestlings, kept them safe somewhere, and put a tape recorder broadcasting the vocalizations of their nestlings. And sure enough, the parents would visit that nest again. In this case, the only cue that they could have been using is the vocalizations. Now, it turns out that this isn't just something that all swallows do. This group of birds here on the right are northern rough-winged swallows, and they do not discriminate. So this is a solitary species. If you do the same type of experiment where you move nestlings around or vocalizations, pre-recorded vocalizations, they just keep revisiting their old nests. They don't go to a new nest or go in search of their offspring. Interestingly, if you look at the nestling vocalizations of northern rough-winged swallows, they're also much simpler, and there's just not very difference between individuals. In the case of the bank swallows, they're much more complex vocalizations, and there clearly is more individual variation that makes this identification possible. So I mentioned that the decalls in the chickadees is associated with their perceived threat level relative to a predator. So here was a study that was published in, I think, Science a few years ago, it may have been Nature, in which they looked at different predators that were put into an aviary. So these were stuffed museum specimens. One was a great gray owl, another would be a gyrfalcon, red-tailed hawk, peregrine falcon. But then they would also put a few mammals in here like cats and ferrets. And there was a general tendency for the bigger the predator, the fewer the D notes that were used. Basically, they're saying, okay, great gray owl, red-tailed hawk, they're potentially predators, but they're fairly big and relatively clumsy, so they're not going to be able to really be a threat to capturing a chickadee. On the other hand, something like a saw-whet owl or a pygmy owl, these are big-time predators of these birds, and so they perceive them as much more of a threat. And so when they would see these species, they would just go crazy with the number of decalls that they would produce. But it's not necessarily just size that they were doing. A comparably sized bird like a bobwhite quail, which clearly isn't a predator, they would see this and they really didn't elicit much in response to seeing something like this. All right, so that's the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll continue talking about vocalizations and really focus on how birds develop their vocalizations. So is it a learned response, or is it something that is instinctual in them?